Hi, everyone. Today I'm doing a screencast video of a blog post that I wrote entitled Economic Causes of the Coup. And I have a lot of charts in here, so I thought it'd be good to kind of walk you through the charts. So this is a non-political piece on the economic causes of the coup attempt on January 6th, 2021. And what I think it is a revolt of the middle class. And I believe that there's fundamental causes of the coup that go back about 50 years, if not a little longer. And basically, it's a tale of the decline of the middle class in America. And in the post-war period after World War II, we had this confluence of events that were really unique and will never be replicated again in the U.S. and maybe not anywhere in the world. But basically, the entire capital stock of the world had really been impaired through the war, and everything needed to be rebuilt. In the U.S., you had the baby boom. You had a lot of governmental programs, the GI Bill, Social Security, you had fiscal stimulus like the Eisenhower highway system. All this came together to create just an absolute explosion in demand. And that led to an incredible rise in the middle class, unlike anything probably that the world had ever seen before. And that there's about 25 years of being in that sweet spot. And Americans came to think that that was the norm and that every generation was going to enjoy upward mobility and you'd be better off than your parents, and that kind of thing. That all turned out to be just a myth, basically. The norm throughout history is that societies are sclerotic. There's very little class mobility, and usually the rich get richer. That's just the way it is. And Thomas Piketty laid this out brilliantly in his book, Capital in the 21st Century. I highly recommend that. But anyway, let me walk you through this. So the first chart here is of presidential administrations since 1970. And you'll see it's fairly even. It's a little bit more on the Republican side, but this is a bipartisan issue. This is not a political issue of one party blaming the other. Both are equally guilty, in my opinion. I talk about the importance of the middle class. It goes back to Aristotle, who thought that the middle class was really the key piece for a country, because they were the ones who really had a stake in it. If you're really wealthy, you don't really have a stake in the society, because if everything goes to hell, you can get out. You have assets. If you're really poor, of course, you have no stake in society, because it's not doing anything for you. But if you're in that middle, then you have a really high stake in society and a high interest in having that society work, because that's your way out. The institutions of the society are your way out. They're the way out for your kids. And so you really want it to work. And then if the middle class gets squeezed and starts to decline, then more and more people do not have a stake in that society. And then bad things start to happen. That's just history. So I talked about the post-war trends. One of the things was the dollar became the dominant currency. Here's a chart of the British pound declining by 80% against the US dollar from the 1920-ish through 2020. I talk about the birth rates. Live births bottomed out in 1935 at 2.4 million and peaked out at 4.3 million in 1957 when the birth rate was 25.3. Last year in the U.S., the birth rate was, call it 12. And the birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 people. So one of the things that's interesting is the decline of unions. Now, no matter what you think about unions politically, it doesn't really matter, because unions really were part of the story. Whether or not they caused, wages to rise, or if they were just, correlated to that, I don't want to get into that debate. But the correlation is very high, and you'll see here, when union membership was high, the share of the income going to the top 10% was around 30, low 30s, 32, 33%. And then when union membership tailed off, the share of income going to top 10%, spikes up to like 50%, while union membership is going down here. So that's a clear trend. And no matter what you think about unions, good or bad, I think there's no debate that strong unions were emblematic of strong labor power. Whether you were in a union or not, didn't matter. When unions were strong, labor had strong bargaining position. And now labor does not. Capital has been dominant for a long time. Now, here's an interesting chart, maybe the most important chart about wages for the middle class, and that's about productivity and wage growth. Now, you'll see in this post-war period, up until 1973, wages and productivity went hand in hand. So as productivity growth increased, meaning that companies were able to produce more with less, wages of the people working in those companies increased right along with them in percentage terms. Wages increased with productivity gains on basically a dollar for dollar basis. In 1973, that changed dramatically, and wages started to go sideways, especially real wages, meaning adjusted for inflation. But productivity growth increased at basically the same rate. So what that meant is that capital was keeping the gains from productivity increases. So costs were coming down to produce the same amount of goods, and capital kept that increased profit margin for itself and did not share it with labor. So that's the big story here economically. And that's just capital sticking it to labor, and that's labor having a very decreased bargaining position. That just is what it is. That's not political. There's no debate about that. Recently, one of the things that's come up is automation and the rise of the robots. And you'll see here that in 1996, there was about, call it 75,000 robots, industrial robots, sold. And the cost was like $120,000 per unit. Now, and this isn't even completely up to date, in 2016, there's like 300,000 or close to 300,000 units sold a year, and the cost is down, looks like around $33,000, maybe $32,000 per unit. So you've had an exponential growth in the use of robots, and the price has come down by about 2/3. That hasn't been good for labor, and it looks like that exponential curve is just going to keep going up. Prices are going to keep coming down. So that hasn't helped labor in the U.S., certainly. So what do we have here? All this adds up to middle class shrinking, and you'll see here is a chart of this. This is the share of income per household by income groups. And the middle 60% in the late 60s was capturing 52% of aggregate household income. That's down to about 46%. And conversely, the top 20% back then was getting about 43%. The top 20% of household incomes on the distribution were getting 43% of the income, and now it's up to 51. So you see the middle class income has declined and the top income earners have increased. That's not good for the society. An interesting thing as well is with taxes. So in that post-war period when economic growth was so strong and the middle class grew so strongly as well, we actually had the highest tax rates in the history of our country. The highest marginal tax rate was, I think it peaked out at 97%, but it was certainly in the mid-90s for a couple of decades here. And then it took a big step down in the 60s to the 70% range. And then it's fallen off now to whatever it is now, 36.9 or whatever. And again, that's the top marginal rate. So it's not the tax rate on all your income. It's just that last bit that gets taxed at that rate. But, whether it was indirectly or directly, the high taxes helped out the middle class and helped out middle class growth. Now, my guess is most of that is probably indirectly through some of those institutions like the GI Bill and Social Security and things like that. That's what that money went to. But that definitely coincided with a stronger middle class. So as things got tougher for the middle class, there was two reactions. Number one, women went back to work. This was part of women's liberation. They got liberated in order to do labor. And you'll see that the two working household family in 1970 was about 31%. That rose by 2015 to 46%. And these household where only the father worked and the mother did not declined from 46% to 26%. So, if the father's wages are not increasing, the mother went back to work to supplement that. The other thing that happened, the other big reaction was household debt, consumer debt really skyrocketed. So household debt to GDP was a little over 20% back in 1950s. That rose to 100%, or right about 100%. Before the global financial crisis. It's come down. Now we're a little under 80%. But that was how households papered over the cracks. The mothers went to work and these households levered up to keep the dream alive. Obviously, that makes households a lot more fragile when you have a lot of leverage. If something happens to your income, of course, you can very easily go bankrupt. I also put in this chart, which shows the consumer credit to GDP and then shows the ratio. And it just shows how more and more debt is needed to produce a dollar's worth of GDP. That's this ratio going up here, which is the ratio of consumer credit to GDP. So that's not good, and that should explain why the Federal Reserve is really worried about downturns in the credit cycle, because if that happens, then GDP takes a bigger hit than it would have 50 years ago, that's for sure. We've talked about real wages. Obviously, inflation is what that's about. CPI inflation has been tame, but that's because they've defined it out of existence. There's other indexes like the Chapwood Index that shows a lot of costs going up 10% a year, not 2% a year. I can tell you that the big ticket items that constitute middle class success and middle class aspiration, those things have gone up a lot, exponentially. Medical care, healthcare costs, education, housing. All those things have increased much more than CPI. And I give an example here. My first year in college, in 1988, cost about $8,000 to go to Elon College. Where I went, that was tuition, room, and board. Now, I played football, so I had a football scholarship, paid for most of that. Obviously, most typical students did not do that, so they had to pay for it. Now that same education costs $52,000 a year, which is an annualized inflation rate of 5.84% over 33 years. That's ridiculous. There's no way that the education has gotten any better than when I was there. Over the same period, if you look at headline CPI, that's averaged 2.5%. So the cost of Elon College, of course, now it's called Elon University, has gone up over twice the rate of CPI inflation. And there's no way to, as they say, hedonically adjust that to make any kind of sense, meaning that the quality of the education doesn't justify the increase in the cost. The other thing I wanted to show on this kind of inflation side is on the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is really complicit in this. They have, or it has, I should say, inflation was a big problem in the 80s, early 80s, and Volcker broke the back of inflation. And since then, anytime inflation, perked up, the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates, which was the macro-prudential thing to do. The problem with that is that about half of inflation comes from wages. So if you keep a lid on inflation, you keep a lid on wage growth. And that's what happened. If you look at this, here's the U.S. hourly wages, real hourly wages. So it's adjusted for inflation. You can see inflation going up. So on an inflation adjusted basis, you're basically making what your grandfather made per hour in 1964. And that's obviously not a good recipe for middle-class success. And the other thing I should mention is by keeping inflation low, the Federal Reserve helped assets inflate, meaning stocks and bonds, while keeping wages down. So it really fed into wealth inequality because the top 1%, the ones that actually own the assets in the country, or the vast majority of them, they saw their assets go up tremendously in value. And the middle class, whose wealth is tied to wages and not to their assets, saw no growth. So that really fed into this wealth inequality. And then just to conclude, democracy is a faith-based system, and so is the U.S. dollar, and so is the whole country, by the way. This is what Yuval Harari wrote about in *Sapiens*. It's a superpower of humanity to be able to tell a story and have everybody believe in it and make it so. If people stop believing in the system, then it just stops working. And this happens, it's happened all through history. If you're a blue-collar worker, you make the same wage as your grandfather, you probably don't have much belief in the system in the U.S. And there's literally millions and millions of U.S. citizens that are in that exact situation. So some of those people ended up scaling the walls of the Capitol building on January 6th. And these are the reasons why I think they did it. It's been in the works for 50 years.